So we're going to start out here. This is our final wrap-up for the Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims study that we've been having. It's kind of interesting. I've been thought about it. This is the only time we're actually going to talk about Thanksgiving, so maybe it should have been the Pilgrims the whole time, and now it's about Thanksgiving. But we're going to start off kind of where we left the Pilgrims, where Squantum, or Tisquantum, or Squanto, as he's been called throughout history, the native man who was, his tribe had pretty much all been wiped out, comes and helps the Pilgrims in Plymouth and helps them find food, helps them learn how to plant, and we kind of left them there. It's kind of around springtime of the year 1621. And we see a lot of different things happen. First off, so we'll kind of take us through the year kind of in quick succession. They finally send the Mayflower back. The Mayflower had been there throughout the winter. The captain and the others, they kind of begged him to stay a little longer. He had to outfit the ship, repair some things, and the crew on his ship got sick as well from kind of just the bad food or lack thereof that we saw that wiped out half the Pilgrims. A lot of his crew were killed as well or died due to that. So it took him a little bit to get back on his voyage, but in May, that spring, he heads back to England. And so if you can kind of think of it there, they get to see kind of the last little bit of England that they took with them goes over the horizon, and that's gone. And so they were all alone, but now they feel more alone. And so the Mayflower leaves, and then they start planting their gardens. And they start planting quite a bit of corn. They brought some seeds with them. They brought peas and oats and some wheat and some other things, some barley. And they planted those, and then Tisquantum teaches them how to plant the Indian corn. It's called Flint Corn. It's a little different than, some people think of it as popcorn. It's not exactly the same thing. It's kind of the colorful Indian corn. Sometimes you see it in fall decorations, but it's a very hard corn, and but it lasted well. And they were able to plant about 20 acres of this corn. And he taught them how to fertilize the ground with shad fish that they would catch, and they'd put them in mounds. They would kind of plant the corn in hills. And it was something that he was teaching them how to plant on their land. It's interesting. So there's a couple accounts of how this happens, and I'm going to read a little bit from a letter. We're going to read a couple different parts from a letter from Edward Winslow. He was also one of the Pilgrims, the separatist group that came over, and he writes this letter back to a friend in England. And we'll be reading through a couple different parts, because this is one of the places we have the best description of what the first Thanksgiving was like. But to start out, he talks to his friend, kind of giving them the info about their start. And here's what he has to say. You shall understand that in this time that few of us have been here. We have built 7 dwelling houses, 4 for the use of the plantation, and 4 for the use of the plantation, and have made preparations for divers others. We set the last spring some 20 acres of Indian corn, sowed some 6 acres of barley and peas, according to the manner of the Indians. We manured our ground with herrings, or rather shads, which we have in great abundance, and take with great ease at our doors. Our corn did prove well, as God be praised, and we had good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good, but our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. They came up very well and blossomed, but the sun parched them in the blossom, our harvest being gotten in. So, and then we'll we'll pick up there, but that's kind of his update on how things went. So some of the things grew well, some of the things didn't. Different soil, different climate, they were kind of learning all these things, and it was a blessing to have to Squantum teaching them how to do this. I know a lot of us here have planted some sort of garden, but I don't think any of us here have planted a garden realizing that if this doesn't work, we're going to be very hungry and maybe starve to death in the winter. I've never had that kind of pressure when I've been gardening. Probably would have stuck to it a lot better. But that was what they were up against. And so they plant, and they're able to grow some crops. And that's a blessing to them. Similarly, reading out of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford writes, "Afterward they, as many as were able, began to plant their corn, in which service Squanto stood them in great stead, showing them both the manner and how to set it, and after how to dress and tend it. Also he told them, except they got fish and set it in these old grounds, it would come to nothing." So the ground was kind of played out, so they needed some fertilizer. And he showed them in the middle of April they should have store enough come up the brook by which they began to build. So there was a brook there, and they would have enough fish coming up that, and taught them how to take it and where to get other provision necessary to them. All of which they found true by trial and experience. Some English seed they sowed as wheat and peas, but it came to no good, either by badness of the seed or lateness of the season, or both of some other defect. So that's kind of how things start off. Now, in this time of planting, there's a tragedy that befalls these pilgrims. They had made it through, it was springtime, it was warm out, things were good, and then a sad tragedy happens to them. And I'll read about what Bradford says about this. "In the morning of April, while they were busy about their seed," so they're planting in their gardens, they're planting in the fields, "their governor, Mr. John Carver, came out of the field very sick, it being a hot day. He complained greatly of his head and lay down, while in a few hours his senses failed him, so he never spake more till he died, which was with a few days after, whose death was much lamented and caused great heaviness among them. As there was cause, he was buried in the best manner they could, with some volleys of shot by all that bore arms, and his wife, being a weak woman, died 5 or 6 weeks after him." So sadly, their beloved governor, John Carver, passes away that spring. They've come out of the winter and they're planting, and at least from the accounts, we believe he probably died of something like a heat stroke. And everyone was weak after all the sickness that had happened, and he winds up passing away. It's interesting, John Carver was a very dear person in this group. He was a leader that had kind of set up the whole voyage over to the New World. Interestingly, if you remember, we talked about Pastor Robinson, their pastor in Leiden. Actually, Pastor Robinson and John Carver were brother-in-laws. They had both married sisters. And so, but sadly, John Carver's wife dies here as well, kind of a broken heart after John Carver passes away, their first governor there in Plymouth. Also, John Carver was one of the kind of thought of as the main writer of the Mayflower Compact that kind of sets in motion their democratic form of government there in the New World. So he was a very important person to this group. So he passes away, and then Bradford continues on. Shortly after, William Bradford, is writing about himself in third person there, was chosen governor in his stead, and being not recovered of his illness, so Bradford was still weak from the winter and the sickness, in which he had been near the point of death, Isaac Allerton was chosen to be an assistant unto him, by renewed election every year, continuing sundry years together, which I here note once for all. So he's kind of talking about he pretty much gets elected every year after this, that William Bradford, until he kind of retires in his 60s, becomes the governor of Plymouth Plantation here. So this happens in the spring, and then continuing on, we have so there's a very small group that has made it through this winter. They've started with about 102 people coming over on the Mayflower. They're now down to 52 after the winter with all that death. It's interesting also, John Carver is kind of the only person that's given an actual funeral. Everyone else was kind of buried in kind of hiding or unmarked graves because they didn't want the natives around them knowing how many were dying. But they do have more of a ceremony with John Carver here. So now William Bradford is the governor. And then they have, after this, they have about May 12th, they have a wedding. There have been many that have passed away, and different, so there's different families where the mother passed away or the father passed away. And so Edward Winslow, the fellow who we're reading this letter from, marries Susanna White. Her husband had passed away, and Edward Winslow's wife had passed away. And so there was a wedding in Plymouth Plantation. This is an interesting time to note. The separatists that came over didn't really, they saw marriage as kind of a civil thing, and they were kind of swinging away from the Catholic Church that made it a very strict sacrament that had to be done in the church, done a particular way. In fact, Edward Winslow, back in England, before they went to Holland or anything else, had wound up in prison about 17 weeks by the Archbishop of Canterbury for actually teaching and preaching and espousing the idea that weddings shouldn't be kind of a church thing, which is kind of interesting. We kind of think of weddings being in the church, but they kind of felt like the weddings were kind of controlled by the church, and they were like, no, we see only two sacraments in the Bible, that is baptism and communion. Other than that, the church shouldn't be involved in death or marrying or anything like that. So they saw it as a civil matter, so they had actually the magistrate of the community, the governor or the vice governor, conduct weddings, conduct marriages. It wasn't not that they maybe wouldn't have prayer or other things, but it wasn't a church thing. That was just their stance on it. Kind of like I said, a swing away from the Catholic Church and then the Church of England kind of being involved in everything. So, interesting to note. So, as they continue on, they have a good harvest of let's see there, of Indian corn, and let me read a little bit about that. So we read a little bit about what Edward Winslow wrote about that, saying that they had a good harvest that came in, though the crops that from England didn't grow as well. The barley and the peas didn't grow nearly as well, but they had plenty of Indian corn. We also they called it a Flint Corn as well. It's kind of looks like this. Though this may even be a little bit too hybridized, kind of what we have today. And so they do very well. They have plenty. And as you can imagine, after going through all they've been through, this would have been a real blessing to know that we're going to go through this next winter and we're going to have plenty of food. And so we have this group of pilgrims. There's about 16 men, 4 women, 23 children, and about 9 servants and a few sailors 9 servants and sailors that had decided to stay from the Mayflower. So there's this group of folks, about 52, and they gather in their crops. And so here I'll continue on with Edward Winslow's letter. He's the one that this is where we kind of get the first Thanksgiving, a clear understanding of what went on. This is about all we have. A little bit of Plymouth Plantation, but this isn't even all that clear as far as what this first Thanksgiving was like. All right, so they gather in all these things, and let's see. And, okay, after we gathered in the fruit of our labors, so he sends out, our governor sends out 4 men on a fowling, and so much, and that we might have after a more special manner, rejoice together. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time almost other recreations, we exercised our arms. So they had some target practice and some military movements as far as their celebration. At arms, many of the Indians coming among us, and among the rest of their great king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, upon the captain and others. Although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want, and we often wish you partakers of our plenty. So he's encouraging his friend over in England, as Edward Winslow writes back, that they have so much during this time that, and it's interesting, some of these things like venison and other things would have been high delicacies in England. And so he's saying, we're eating very well at this time and encouraging more people to come over. William Bradford has this to say kind of about this time, the first Thanksgiving. They began now to gather in their small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, had all things in good plenty. For as some would thus be employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took a good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as with winter approaching, of which this place did abound when they came at first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. So there was quite a bit of birds there for hunting, but it kind of went away as more people came. And besides waterfowl, there was a great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now, since harvest, Indian corn to that portion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned, but true reports. So that's what he writes about it. So there's not really a clear, we all got together and did this, but talking about the good harvest that they had. So, kind of digging into what this would have looked like. So we have, and it's always interesting, what did they eat and what didn't they eat? And of course, we have an idea of what Thanksgiving is, and let's kind of talk through what they would have had and what they wouldn't have had at the first Thanksgiving. This is kind of funny. I was just kind of thinking through this. We have a lot of people that would probably appreciate some of the things that they didn't incorporate into their Thanksgiving dinner. They didn't have any sugar. They used it all up. They didn't have any sugar. So no sugar. It's a sugar-free Thanksgiving. They had no flour because they'd used all that up as well, and their wheat crop didn't really work. So no sugar and no wheat, no gluten. So we're good there. They had very little oil. They had a little bit of olive oil possibly or something like that, but that would have had to been saved. No butter or dairy. As far as we know, the first cattle come into the colony in about 2 or 3 ships that come in later. I think it's the Anne that brings cattle. So they may have had goats, but we don't know. We know there's accounts they may have had some dogs. We're not sure if they had chickens or pigs or anything else, but really no dairy to speak of. No potatoes, so no mashed potatoes, no sweet potatoes. Potatoes are a South American thing. They've kind of come to England, but they've not really been introduced to New England, so none of that. And no popcorn. This kind of corn doesn't pop, it parches, which they did. You kind of roast it, and it's kind of a crunchy snack, but it's not not popcorn. That's a legend that kind of got started later. No cider, not a lot of those kind of tree fruits like pears or anything like that. They do talk about plums being wild there, but no cider. And cranberries were used by the Native Americans for dyeing. Not until we really got plenty of sugar in cranberries did anybody ever want to really eat cranberries. Ocean spray cranberries kind of made it a thing because you can dump a lot of sugar in them and then they're palatable. So, so no cranberries the first Thanksgiving. So what did they eat? As they were preparing, they would have had quite a bit of seafood. Interestingly, they talk about being able to kind of catch lobsters by hand and eels by hand. Lobsters are interesting as well. Lobsters up until like early 1900s were kind of considered trash and poor people's food. There's actually accounts of around the American Revolution, there were dock workers that rioted because they had to eat lobster like 2 or 3 times a week or something. It was they were unhappy because it was poor people's food. Now it's completely different, which is the way things go. But so they would have lobster, a lot of clams and mussels and those kind of things. They could catch a lot of the eels, which they ate. Doesn't sound necessarily like something I'd want, but they would have that. They had venison, they had fowl, which is interesting because they call it fowl. Yes, they had wild turkeys, but there were also different kinds of birds. One of the birds that they talk about quite a bit and being able to catch by hand because they were so thick. You'd go out at night and you could pick them out of the trees by hand were passenger pigeons. Passenger pigeons are no longer around, partially because they were so easy to kill. They're extinct now, but passenger pigeons were something that they could catch kind of by the basket load and eat when they were in migration through that area, which kind of Tusco, but yeah, so you could have eaten venison and passenger pigeon are far more, traditional, original Thanksgiving than baked potato or mashed potatoes and pumpkin pie. I mean, it's kind of funny to think about. So they had corn, they had nuts, they had berries. They did eat pumpkins. They enjoyed those, but they kind of stewed them or kind of made a custard in them. But if you don't have, we're not sure if they had eggs, and we know they didn't have milk, so that would be hard to do. But they did enjoy pumpkins. So kind of a little interesting thing. And then how would it have been served? Well, in that time frame, and parents might like this, traditionally the adults would eat and the children would wait on them. And the children would stand. There was not enough chairs for children. So children would stand at the table and the servants and children would wait on the adults and then they would eat afterwards. So a little different than what we have where parents usually serve the kids. But that was their tradition at the time. As your table's set out, you're going to have a few knives, a very few spoons. Those were kind of highly prized. No forks. Forks don't show up till much later. And then you eat out of a trencher, which is kind of a wooden, they had some stoneware, but it was mostly like a wooden type of like a square wooden bowl that you would kind of have. And most things were served with your hands and eaten with your hands. And so they usually would have about a 3 foot by 3 foot linen napkin. That was kind of important because you're using your hands a lot. So some of the kids in here might like that part. But more eating with your hands. And so if you think about it, there were only 4 women to serve this whole thing, so they had help from the servants and other people to help. But there's only 4 women: Elizabeth Hopkins, Eleanor Billington, Mary Brewster, and Susanna Winslow now, but she was Susanna White before, but she's the one that got married. So only 4 women that make it through this time. Interesting, so that kind of wraps up what the first Thanksgiving would have looked like. Interesting, gluten-free, sugar-free, dairy-free, so, we're kind of getting back to that. But interesting to kind of think about, and it was mainly due to stuff they didn't have, not necessarily out of intention. Also, when you think about it, they really did appreciate days of Thanksgiving. That was important to them. But holidays in general was something they didn't celebrate a lot of. They didn't celebrate Christmas at all, or Easter. They saw those both as kind of things that had come out of the Catholic Church, and they wanted to have nothing to do with them. They saw them as pagan holidays, and they didn't want to have anything to do with them. Some of the folks, like we talked about, weren't of the separatist mindset that came over with them. And some of them did want to kind of at least have the day off on Christmas, and so they maybe kind of did something of a Christmas type thing, but it really wasn't that big of a celebration at all. But as the separatists, they didn't celebrate any of those holidays, so this was kind of a unique thing to kind of have a feast together. And it wasn't something that they did year after year. It talks about them having a couple different ones, but it wasn't something that was just a yearly thing that would happen one after the other. So just some different things that I pulled together here. So let's see. So they exercising their arms. We already read about that. And then wild turkeys. Got too many slides in here. And then the first Thanksgiving. So that is kind of wraps up the first Thanksgiving. It would have been a simple time, but a time to give thanks to God for bringing them through this very hard winter. But they have plenty. They have plenty going into this new year and into this winter. Winter is the time when you can't really grow anything. And so you're able to gather in what you need for that time. The interesting part, and this is kind of what happens right after this, is they see in the next couple weeks after that first Thanksgiving, they see a ship on the horizon. And you would think, oh, hooray, a ship. Well, no. If you don't know who's on the ship, this could be bad. This could be pirates, this could be the French, this could be the Dutch, which all are bad for them. Nothing against the French. But they weren't real friendly back then. And so they were worried about who these guys were. But then they figure out, okay, they're English. And but it's interesting because Edward Winslow writes a little bit about what they saw. And so he talks a little bit about these men that came over on this ship called the Fortune. The Fortune shows up, and they are able to. Let me see. I think that's the wrong book. Okay, so the Fortune arrives, and here's what William Bradford has to say about it. In November, about the time of 12th of them, or that themselves came, so about a year since they came, there came a small ship to them, unexpected or looked for, in which came Mr. Cushman, so much spoken of before, with him 35 persons to remain and live on our plantation, which did not a little rejoice at them. And they, when they came ashore, found all well and saw plenty of victuals in every house, and were no less glad, for most of them were lusty young men, many of them wild enough, who with little consider whither or about what they went, till they came into the harbor at Cape Cod, and there saw nothing but a barren place. And they began to think what should become of them, if the people there were dead or cut off by Indians. So they had kind of worried aboard ship, thinking that there wasn't anybody here, but they do find them. And they began to consult upon some speeches, and some of the seamen had cast out to take the sails from, so the men aboard ship who had come over were kind of thinking of kind of mutinying against the captain to get them out of there. But the master, hearing of this, gave good word and told them if anything but well should have befallen the people there, he hoped that the victuals enough to carry them to Virginia. So he said if these people, because they didn't know if they'd made it or not. They didn't know if the Pilgrims had made it. They didn't know if anybody lived here. Like we talked about at the beginning, they weren't even planning to settle in this Cape Cod area. That's where they kind of ended up in the middle of December. So he kind of reassures them. And so they were all landed, and there was not so much as a biscuit cake or other victuals for them. Neither had they any bedding, but some sorry things that they had in their cabins, nor pot nor pan to dress any meat in, nor over many clothes, or many of them had brushed away their coats and cloaks at Plymouth as they came, but there was sent over some birching lane suits in the ship, out of which they were supplied. The plantation was glad for this addition of strength, so it was good to have some extra hands to do the work, but could have wished that many of them had been of better condition, and all of them better furnished with provisions. But that could not be helped now. So, interestingly, we have this great Thanksgiving, which is wonderful, but these guys all show up, and they're hungry, and they didn't bring enough food with them, and they didn't bring a lot of supplies with them. And so this is something that if you continue to listen to, highly recommend. There's an audiobook version you can find for free on YouTube or other places of Plymouth Plantation. It's about 11 hours to listen to. Very interesting to listen through because we're only about that far into the book. It talks much about their goings back and forth and what all happens to them after this. But this gives you a little taste, I'm going to continue on, of the struggle that they had, because people would come over kind of looking to be helped and taken care of. And then the speculators, Mr. Weston and the speculators that had funded this trip, were kind of troublesome. Here's what they, so here's kind of what they said about them. In this ship, Mr. Weston sent a large letter to Mr. Carver. Of course, Mr. Carver's dead. He would have been the governor, but they didn't know that yet. The late governor, now deceased, full of complaints and explosions or exploitations about former passengers at Hampton and the keeping the ship so long in the country, so keeping the Mayflower there for so long and returning her without lading, so they didn't send it back with anything, any provisions or any furs or anything. So that was kind of, it's like we were just happy to be alive, but you didn't get that part. And returning her without lading, which, if brevity I admit, and so he puts in the letter here, and it was, and so this guy kind of is very, doesn't understand the situation very well, and is kind of saying, you guys aren't holding up your end of the deal, because they were looking to get something out of their investment. And so this is part of what the struggle that the Pilgrims deal with for about 7 to 10 years after the first Thanksgiving and everything else, is they're working for these people, the speculators, the people that funded this trip. And so they have to, deal with this. They send back some stuff here on the Fortune. They continue to send things back now that they're doing well, but they also are dealing with these people that are coming over, sent by these speculators that don't have anything with them. So they've got to feed more people, they've got to supply more people, and so it's a very difficult thing that they find themselves in. He writes here, the ship called the Fortune was speedily dispatched away, being laden with good clapboards, as full as she could stow. So they make clapboards, which is kind of a wood siding, but they would have built that or milled that out of the lumber they had there. 2 hogsheads of beaver and otter skins, which they had gotten with a few trifling commodities brought with them at first, which are being altogether unprovided for trade. So they hadn't even sent them on this ship, the Fortune, they hadn't sent them trinkets and beads and knives and things to trade with the natives to get hides. So it's like, how do you expect us to send anything back? It's kind of an issue that they find themselves in. Neither was there any among them that ever saw a beaver skin till they came here and were informed by Squanto. So even the Pilgrims that came over didn't really know what they were looking for. They didn't even know what a beaver skin was to send it back. But Squanto steps in again, or to Squantum, and he helps them again with this. So, and the freight was estimated to be worth about 500 pounds, and a Mr. Cushman returns with the ship, and they send back a letter kind of explaining, half of us died last winter, and we're happy to be alive, and we're happy to have food, and tries to kind of plead and make this Mr. Weston and the other speculators that funded this thing understand the plight that they were in. And so things continue on. They continue on there in Plymouth, and for many, many years they struggle, but things get better and better. They have different situations that happen where other companies of people come. Some of them are good friends from their separatist group that bring, a pastor comes over for a while. There are also folks that come over that are just bent on kind of making a mess of things and getting money for themselves, and they kind of set up I think about a little ways up, they set up a few men, kind of adventurers, set up a trading post and are trading guns with the Indians, which nobody's supposed to do. That's against all the rules, because if the Indians get guns, then they have guns. Not good, and so Captain Standish has to go march up there and disarm them, and they don't put up much of a fight because they ran out of all their food. But so they kind of wind up actually having to be the policeman over there a little bit. But thankfully, their relations with the natives there, at least through these first generations, is good. And the Lord provides for them, takes care of them, and meets their needs. It's interesting, Edward Winslow continues on in this letter to his friend, which I think got sent back on the Fortune or one of those ships. He writes, "Never in my life," let's see here. Yep. "Never in my life remember a more seasonable year than we have enjoyed, and if, having once kine, horses, and sheep, I make no question, but men might live as content here as in any other part of the world. For fish and fowl we have in great abundance. Fresh cod in the summer is but of course meal with us," so it's kind of just everyday food. "Our bay is full of lobsters all summer, and affordeth variety of other fish. In September we can take a hogshead of eels in a night with small labor, and can dig them out of their beds all the winter. We have mussels, and oysters we have none this near, but we can have them brought by Indians when we will. All the springtime the earth sheddeth forth naturally very good shallot herbs," so it'd be like wild onions, "and their grapes, white and red, variety sweet and strong also. Strawberries, gooseberries, and etc. Plums of three sorts, with black and red, being almost as good as damson. Abundance of roses, white and red, and damask, and very sweet indeed." So he's kind of saying this is a good country. It's also interesting, if you think of what other happened here on the Fortune, he also writes to his friends, "I thought it good to advise you of a few things needful. Be careful to have a very good bread room to put your biscuit in, lest," and so he's basically saying, make sure you have plenty of bread and make sure it's in good containers. That was an issue. Stuff would go bad. "Let your cask of beer and water be iron bound, of the first tier, if not more. Let not your meat be dry salted, nor can do better than the sailors. Let your meat be so hard trod in your casks that you shall need an adze or hatchet to work it out." So he's saying, preserve the food really good. "Trust not too much on us for corn at this time, for by reason of the last company that came, depending wholly upon us, we shall have little enough till harvest." So he's kind of saying, we didn't have enough when these guys came. So if you come, bring enough stuff for yourself. "Be careful to come by some of your meal or spend by the way. It will much refresh you. Build your cabins as open as you can. Bring good stores of clothes and bedding with you. Bring every man a musket or fowling piece. Let your piece be long in the barrel, and fear not the weight of it, for most of our shooting is from standing. Bring juice of lemons, and take it fasting. It is for good use. For hot waters, aniseed water is the best, but use it sparingly. That would be for kind of stomach ailments, settles your stomach. If you bring anything to comfort in the country, bring butter or salad oil, which is kind of a term they use for olive oil, or both is very good. Our Indian corn, even the coarsest, maketh a pleasant meal as rice. Therefore spare that unless to spend by the way. Bring paper and linseed oil for your windows, with cotton yarn for your lamps. Let your shot be most of for large fowls. Bring stores of powder and shot. I forbear writing further for the present, hoping to see you by next return. So I take my leave, commending you to the Lord for safe conduct unto us, resting in him, Plymouth, New England, your friend Edward Winslow. So that's what he was encouraging his friend to bring with him if he came to Plymouth. All right, so here's kind of where we leave our folks in Plymouth. There's a couple more things. One interesting thing that they find is that early on, and Pastor kind of mentioned this a while back, but they, right now and until a couple of years into Plymouth Plantation, everything's kind of jointly owned. It's kind of a communist system. And because everybody had kind of put themselves under the debt that they had to pay off, it was kind of made sense. But it didn't work out very well, because if we're all working on this farm together, but if you work really, really hard and the next guy doesn't work at all, and you both get the same result, that kind of discourages the guy that worked really, really hard. And it also rewards the guy that didn't work at all. And that's unbiblical. If you don't work, you shouldn't eat. So they find, and they were kind of going off some different government styles because they didn't really know about governing themselves. But here's what, from William Bradford, what he kind of said about that. And in about 2 or 3 years, they get rid of that and give each person their plot of land to farm, and things go great after that. It really is good, and here's what he had to say. The failure of this experiment in communal service, which is what he's calling this, where everybody kind of owns everything in common, which was tried for several years and by good and honest men, so these weren't guys trying to cheat each other necessarily, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients, applauded by some of later times. So, we still have people that applaud these ideas too. That the taking away of private property and possession of it in the community or by a commonwealth would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property, so far as it went, was found to breed much confusion, discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit and comfort. Let none argue that this is due to human failing, rather that it is to a domestic plan of life itself. I answer, seeing that all men having this failing in them, that God in his wisdom saw another plan for life was fitter for them. So he's referring to, and in different parts he writes about kind of the Jewish idea of true kind of happiness is sitting under your own vine and fig tree. We hear a lot about that in the Old Testament, which, private property, owning your own property, owning your own fields. And the Bible talks about, personal discipline and personal, if a man works, a man should provide for his family. If you don't work, you shouldn't eat, all those things. And so they install those into their government, and things go very, very well. Wrapping up, I'm going to leave you, at least this part, with kind of these final words from William Bradford. And this is kind of his, kind of what he saw this group as. Last and not least, they cherished a great hope, an inward zeal of laying a good foundations, or at least making some way towards it, for the propagation and advancement of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work. So this is kind of the picture that we have from these separatists that, as we've traced them, coming out of England, being very persecuted and trodden down, them kind of leaving all and moving to Holland, trying to make a go of it there for about 12 years, and then coming to the New World. They really, and you think about it, how many of them passed away, how many of them died of sickness and disease. They saw themselves as kind of that front line, the tip of the spear, as stepping stones to others that would come and establish a place where we could have freedom to meet together, freedom to read the Bible and to worship as we see fit, and also bringing the gospel of Christ to a new place. And that's very much what they did. And it's interesting to take note of what they did during this time. So I'm going to wrap up with a little side note. So how did we get Thanksgiving? How did we get the actual Thanksgiving holiday? So I've got two little things we're going to touch on here before we wrap up tonight. So how do we get Thanksgiving? Well, Thanksgiving's a holiday. It's a national holiday. It happens same time every year, same Thursday. And so how did we get there? Well, it's interesting. So Thanksgiving celebrations were kind of a New England thing after this, but they continue on, but they're not really like national or anything like that. But around the American Revolution, we do have a few that show up. In fact, there are about 9 that Congress puts forward. They put forward to have these days of Thanksgiving after things went well in the American Revolution for them and other things. They weren't necessarily a fall thing, they just had days of Thanksgiving. They also had days of fasting and prayer when things weren't going so well. But it is interesting, after the War for Independence is won, they have put together a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. The Congress, one of the first things they do is they resolve to encourage the president to have a day of Thanksgiving and prayer after they have the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are signed and are ratified. And so they write this, a couple different guys, Mr. Roger Sherman, justify the practice of Thanksgiving on any single event, not only as laudable on itself, but also as warranted by a number of precedents in the Holy Writ. That's the Bible. So he's saying the Bible has many times when people got together and were thankful for deliverance. So it's important we should do this. And so that congressional resolution was delivered to President Washington at the time, and he heartily concurred with the request and issued this first federal Thanksgiving proclamation, declaring it in part. So here's a little excerpt from what George Washington said to the people. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor, now therefore I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November, 1789, that we may all unite to render unto Him our sincere and humble thanks for His kind care and protection. So we see that happen. We see, and this is just kind of a one-time thing, but we see other presidents do this from time to time. Adams and Jefferson do this as well. It's interesting, the Protestant Episcopal Church, which George Washington was a part of, also kind of to its members announced that the first Thursday in November would become its regular day of Thanksgiving unless it was appointed by the civil authorities. So if the government said we're going to have a different day, they would do that. But some of the churches kind of set forward a day of Thanksgiving. And then so it continues on, but it's kind of sporadic. From time to time, it's not a given date. And then around the 1860s, interestingly, a lady, Mrs. Sarah Josepha Hale, she's an editor in a book called The Gaudy's Ladies Book, which was kind of a ladies' book that went out, a kind of a periodical that went out. It contained poetry and artwork and different articles about things. And she kind of got on this mission to get Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. And she kind of gets after President Lincoln about it. And President Lincoln, by 1863, does this. He sets up this Thanksgiving Declaration. So thank you, Nelson, for picking Battle Hymn of the Republic for as we were getting together. Very fitting. So Abraham Lincoln has this proclamation. Here's the proclamation up here for what Abraham Lincoln puts out. And this is kind of makes Thanksgiving more of a national holiday. And he gives out a declaration that goes along with this. This is the middle of the Civil War. Things are very dark and hard as far as the nation being in war. But he does declare this time of Thanksgiving. And here's a little excerpt from Abraham Lincoln's address on Thanksgiving. The year as it draws towards its close has been filled with blessing by fruitful fields and healthful skies. To the bounties which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source of which they come from, others have been added which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart, which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any moral hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gift of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. So he's kind of talking a little bit about God's deliverance in battle, though they also have lost many. And Abraham Lincoln definitely saw the Civil War as kind of a judgment on the nation for slavery. So he's kind of talking about being dealt with for their sins as a nation, but also God showing his mercy. And so they had this time of thanksgiving that he had there. And then, as things went on, we have a Thanksgiving Day so each president kind of got to pick what day Thanksgiving would be on. And then in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, kind of right before World War II, kind of issued and set in place that the fourth Thursday of each November, Congress permanently established the day as National Day of Thanksgiving. So that's kind of a background on how we have Thanksgiving on the day we have it. It's definitely something that was a good thing to have, and back in the Pilgrims' day, other groups that had Thanksgivings, it was a Thanksgiving feast type thing, and but it's a good time. It's a good holiday to be thankful and to think of those who have gone before, to think of the Pilgrims and others that have gone before, and not necessarily as much as it becomes now a commercial thing or something about just the food, about turkey or about those things, but it's a day to remember those who have gone before. One interesting thing, and I'm going to kind of give one more little thing that I want to talk about that I think is kind of neat, and I've been referencing a particular book quite a bit. That's Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. And it's interesting, we almost didn't have this book. But this book is a very interesting look at an early group of believers working through a lot of trials, working through a lot of things, and a very interesting glimpse into the history of this time. But the reason we almost didn't have this book is very interesting. So Bradford's original manuscript was left in the tower of the Old South Meeting House in Boston during the American Revolution. We had the original, and it was left in Boston. The British troops occupied that church during the war, and the manuscript disappeared. This happened with a lot of different manuscripts, and they disappeared. Some British soldier took it back to England somehow as a trophy or whatever. And a lot of people thought it was lost. And it remained lost for the next century. For about 100 years, this book was lost. We knew it existed at one time, but it was kind of lost to history. It's interesting. The missing manuscript was finally discovered in the Bishop of London's library at Felham Palace. It was brought back into print in 1856, and Americans made many formal proposals the manuscript should be returned to New England, but to no avail. Massachusetts Senator George Frisbee Hoare started an initiative in 1897, supported by the Pilgrim Society and the American Antiquarian Society and the New England Society of New York. So these groups got together and said, hey, we want this book back. The Bishop of London, Frederick Temple, learning of the importance of the book, and he thought that it should be returned to America. But it was being held by the Church of England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury needed to approve such a move. So, church and state still going on there. The bishop's Constitutional and Episcopal Court of London observed that nobody could say for certain either how the book arrived in London, but he arranged that the marriage and the birth registry which it contained should be deposited in the church in the first place, and thus the book was a church document, and the Diocese of London had proper control of it. The court, however, observed the Diocese of London was not the proper repository for the information of the time when the 13 colonies declared independence in 1776. So the Bishop's Court ordered a photocopy of records be made of it, and the original to be delivered to the governor of Massachusetts. So the original was back, given back to the United States. Bradford's journal was presented to the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts during a joint session of the legislature in 1897, and it is deposited in the State Library of Massachusetts in the State House of Boston. The state legislature ordered the publication of the history with copies of the documents associated in return in 1912, and the Massachusetts Historical Society published a final authorized version of the text. And so it's, as far as we know, it's still there. It's about a 400-year-old book at this point, but it is still there. And it's interesting. There are a few pages missing, and there's it's all in Bradford's handwriting. So there are some things that he kind of misnumbered pages and stuff, but they think they have most of it. And so that is how we have pretty much what I was able to share with you. That's how we have all that information, is because it was found, and it was taken back to England, kind of lost for a while, and then it was found again. But it's interesting to have this as kind of it's kind of one of those founding father documents that we're able to see into this time in history, what the Pilgrims went through, what they suffered to come to this country, and as William Bradford said, to be stepping stones, to be the first to kind of set up a place for religious liberty, for people to worship God in the way that their conscience dictates, and to bring the gospel of Christ to the New World. So, with that, we are going to end our study on the Pilgrims. Went a little longer tonight, but it was a good study, and I'm going to pray, and then we will have prayer requests. And if you have any questions about the Pilgrims, I don't know everything about them, but been studying them for a month now, a little bit. So if you have any questions or any thoughts, we can talk afterwards. And hope this was an interesting and helpful to kind of patch in a piece of history in your mind, and to understand a little bit of what our forefathers went through to get the Bible in our hands, to get even a place where we can worship God in a free country.